And I just want straight away to acknowledge the amazing support I've been given by Anita and her team, particularly Mick at Rosmini, who made my work as smooth running as possible, given that I was working at a distance, and at one point I was hospitalised with a serious condition. So I'd like to think this was an extremely good example of a collaboration between research and action, leading, we all hope, to some significant changes in policy and practice. Before I talk about the report, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves that this project and others have had to work within what has been known as the hostile environment for migrants. This environment has led to a number of outrages, not least, but not only, the Windrush scandal, but the ratcheting up of practices to ensure that whatever the government may claim, the UK is actually becoming an extraordinarily unwelcoming country for migrants, leading to illegal deportations, separation of families, deaths on lorries. If you don't believe me, read the report that Sarah Thornton referred to, the report on Monday of the Select Committee, House of Commons on Foreign Affairs, which attributes the death of the 39 Vietnamese migrants to this hostile environment, the fact that people are driven more and more underground in their desperation to come to Britain and seek a good future, not to steal our jobs, not to steal our houses and all the rest of it, but actually contribute to this country. When I was in hospital, I did a little count for the 5 days I was in there. 95% of the people who actually attended me were non-UK nationals. They bandaged me, they fed me, they nursed me, they moved me around, they cleaned the floor, and all the rest of it. And as somebody said the other day to me, I went into hospital the other day full of bloody migrants. Somebody gave me an injection, somebody bandaged me, somebody put me in a wheelchair, somebody moved me around, somebody consulted me, and all the rest of it. Migrants make an enormous contribution to this country in social and economic terms. And I think the way we're treating many of them is appalling. And I have my own tale to tell about the co-option of professionals from many walks of life into acting as unpaid border force spies. It's the only way I can put it. I've been a university professor for 25 years. I was born in Lancashire. I've lived in the UK all my life. I was recently asked by a UK university to examine a doctorate. Now, I've examined 23 over the last years at 20 different universities. Notwithstanding this, I was asked to produce my passport to prove that I had a right to examine this PhD. Now, I was absolutely outraged. I'm outraged when that happens to me. How must it feel to migrants who are treated in that sort of way when they have a perfectly normal desire to better their lives, not at somebody else's expense, but to better their lives and support their family? And I mention this not to make a political point, but because, overstretched and hard-working as all the staff at Rosmini are, it's clear that they're barely touching the tip of the iceberg. Many migrants, whatever their status, are fearful, particularly in the context of a media which spends its time reporting lies and waging a disgusting war in words against them, which has clearly, as I said earlier, impacted significantly on public opinion. Migrants find it difficult even to approach what we might regard as a neutral and helpful organisation for fear they'll be reported to the authorities and deported. And there's very clear evidence that in the field of modern slavery, many victims do not agree to submit themselves to the vagaries of the National Referral Mechanism for the same reason. Sarah mentioned the numbers. Last year, almost 7,000. This year, maybe 10,000. But that, again, is just the tip of an iceberg. There are many who don't. And unfortunately, we know from work from the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group that the NRM actually operates in a profoundly racist way. If you're white, European, claiming victimhood for modern slavery, you have 3 times the chance of your claim being accepted than if you're a black African. That's not a chance. That is an institutional fact, and that needs to be addressed too. So, to the study. It had become increasingly clear to staff at Rosmini over the past few years that the issue of modern slavery was deeply interwoven into the lives of the migrant population in the area. They wanted to understand the dynamics of modern slavery and ways of strengthening their response. There were statutory organisations active in the area, including local authorities, police, fire and rescue, health bodies, the GLAA, HMRC, all in different degrees depending on the work in question, the issues being addressed. In my study, I did a literature review, I did a scoping exploration of the area, a review and secondary analysis of relevant data, some of which was a bit dodgy, and I did interviews with a wide range of key actors, with a further 4 key actors unavailable or unwilling to be interviewed. Modern slavery has become a prominent issue in the area, it appeared, and also nationally in the last 5 years, and I think this study, as Steve Barclay kindly said, is a very timely one. Some of the key issues emerging were as follows. Although the importance of partnership working was stressed, and if you look nationally, you see that partnerships have been popping up all over the place in terms of modern slavery work. I mentioned earlier that I'd helped to set up one in Humberside. I've also helped to set up one in North Yorkshire, but there are 30 or 40 across the country now. But although the importance of partnership working was stressed, many NGOs regarded themselves as marginal too and excluded from much of partnership working, and I hope that will change. Second, I'm sorry to say that the claims made by the government that the Modern Slavery Act was to be regarded as world-leading were regarded with some scepticism because a number of failings are very clear. You don't need me to spell them out. It's quite extraordinary that a world-leading so-called piece of legislation should be subject to an independent review sponsored by government within 4 years of it being established. And indeed is also, again, this has fallen, but I hope it'll be revived in the next government, the subject of a review from the Home Affairs Select Committee. On your table, this is the advertisement break. You'll find a leaflet for a book called The Modern Slavery Agenda, and this is specifically a critique, 300 pages long, of aspects of the Modern Slavery Act which have yet to be dealt with. Thirdly, the importance of having publicity and campaign materials in key languages other than English was stressed. Some organisations had embraced this need, others less so. Publicity was often not coordinated between agencies, and that's an important area of partnership working. I was asked to do some training. I did 4 training sessions. There was a high level of demand. I did about 150 people attending one of the 4 training sessions in Wisbech and Ely. The overall rating was about 4.5 on a scale of 1.5, so people were obviously highly satisfied with it. The majority of those attending came from 4 sectors: local government, police, NGOs, and housing providers. Particularly noticeable by their absence were representatives of health organisations, and that's strange, and I never really did get to the bottom of it. Parts of the NHS are now beginning to address that issue nationally. There is, for example, Royal College of Nurses has produced guidance. The NHS itself has actually produced guidance on modern slavery, but I think the NHS is such a big organisation, it's probably a question in some cases of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. We in North Yorkshire have actually just started a campaign to make sure that GP practices have leaflets about modern slavery, because quite often people present at GP practices unexplained injuries, vaginal injuries, bruising, whatever, and doctors need to know, and practice nurses need to know what they're looking for, and at the moment I suspect a lot of them don't. So it's clear that there remains a need for considerably more training, especially for frontline staff, many of whom still seem unaware of the NRM and their responsibilities under the legislation, especially as first responders. I've been in a room with 80 social workers, and said, which of you are first responders? Nobody put their hand up. Well, actually, they all were, and that's actually quite alarming. More generally, there still remains within some organisations a lack of understanding of cultural difference, exploitation, modern-day slavery, resulting in a negative attitude and a lack of empathy. And this often leads to inequalities in service delivery, and I'm sure this is going to be picked up by Margaret in her report on work with migrant workers. There was some very good positive action that's already been referred to, which appears to have made a difference in the area, initiated through the Community Diversity Forum, chaired by Fenland District Council. David Bailey is going to be talking about that a little bit later on. And that brings together most organisations working with diverse communities. It enables organisations to share information, tackle issues, has an action plan, which all organisations are encouraged to take ownership of. Whilst, as I noted, there were several very active NGOs in the area, faith groups, with one or two exceptions, had made a much less significant anti-slavery input. And I contrast that with some other areas where I'm familiar with the work where faith groups have made a very significant input, and we will hear later on from a particular initiative sponsored by the Church of England. The Church, of course, has a potentially very important role to play, particularly in rural areas, as it has parish populations at grassroots level across the whole of the country. And I don't think there's any other organisation which can claim that. So in terms of actually working upwards, awareness raising, publicity campaigns and all the rest of it, the Church is in an ideal position to do some of this. I'm afraid to say, I don't know if there's a representative of the Army here, but the Salvation Army were notably lacking in their support for my work, and I failed to interview anybody there. They have in Wisbech a wonderful new hostel, which I guess from the outside, I never got inside it, could probably house 30 or 40 people. When I went there, it was always locked up, absolutely quiet. And this is ironic, given the fact that nationally the Salvation Army hold the government contract for housing victims of modern-day slavery. Some statutory organisations have modern slavery as part of a wider remit. Some have modern slavery as a specialised area of work, but within a subgroup or subcommittee, or even a single officer reporting to a body with wider responsibilities. But there were not specialised and well-resourced organisations in the statutory sector with a single focus on modern slavery work. And that means there's a slightly complex array of organisational approaches, and that obviously impairs and impedes collaboration and coordination. I would hope that some sort of review of these organisational arrangements might take place following the publication of these reports. Whilst each organisation encountering potentially slavery victims worked to support them individually within their own frame of reference, there was no coordinated victim support strategy across the piece, including a safe house for victims within or near to Wisbech. And it's recognised elsewhere in the UK that such strategies need to include provision for individual support, counselling, money advice, housing, benefit support, support for children, and help into work. This requires both a strategic approach and effective funding. The overwhelming majority of modern slavery cases in the past few years have concerned labour exploitation, often linked to housing exploitation, as we saw in the film. One respondent noted that sex trafficking was probably more widespread than known about, particularly now as small, short-term pop-up brothels were difficult to monitor, although these tended to appear more in the urban centres of Cambridge and Peterborough. Trafficking and labour exploitation, of course, might be occurring simultaneously, and new forms of modern slavery are emerging in Cambridgeshire. County lines, not perhaps as rapidly as it is, particularly in my area of North Yorkshire. Organ trafficking is now beginning to be a serious problem. It's important that training and awareness raising, both for paid workers and for the public, is kept fully up to date. Whilst it's true that most of those identified as being in forms of modern slavery were of non-UK nationality, particularly from East and Central Europe, It's important to stress that some were UK nationals, often people with learning disabilities, who'd been picked up at homeless hostels, soup kitchens and so on, and then taken to work in highly exploitative conditions. And proactive work might focus on these sites. Nationally, it's now the case that the largest single number of victims of modern slavery are in fact UK nationals. They're not migrants, they're not foreigners, they're UK nationals. The largest single number of people in modern slavery in this country. And as I mentioned, the more recent phenomenon of county lines is said to be less prevalent, but I think it's beginning to appear. And there have been a noticeable increase of cannabis farms and illegal car washes in recent years. And just to add a few thoughts in conclusion about the dimension of rurality, and this isn't in my report, it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. There's some dimensions of rurality which make work in rural areas different and in some ways more challenging. First of all, there's the different profile of forms of modern slavery, with a particular emphasis on labour exploitation to be found in rural areas. The distances between towns and centres of population, the sparseness of those populations, the stretching of resources, meaning that anti-slavery responses are likely to be more difficult and more costly, particularly where rural transport, as has been the case across the country for the last few years, has been wound down and is very, very sparse too. So those rural logistical issues impact on organised responses, and we need to think of creative ways of developing a response which takes account of rurality. It's very difficult, I found in North Yorkshire, it's very difficult to create a sustainable partnership. If you want to meet in Scarborough, then everyone in Skipton's got a 120-mile round journey just to go to a meeting. That's a day out just for one meeting. And the same is true in many, many rural areas. It's extremely different. So we have to make use, I think, of digital technology and of teleconferences and all that sort of thing to try and get on top of the rural dimension of distance. The generally low level of experience of minorities in rural areas and the misrepresentation of their impacts on local life generated by hostile media means that public attitudes to the vulnerability of minorities are likely to be mixed at least, and we saw this in the film, downright hostile at worst. People learn what they learn often from the newspapers. So victims of modern slavery are less likely to be identified, supported, or given the kind of help that they might need than those in more urban settings. And they're certainly less likely to seek help. And it's significantly more difficult, even where agencies have the political will, for them to work together in effective partnership in rural areas. This requires greater levels of investment in time and other resources. Agencies have to find creative ways to build strong partnerships. So these and other dimensions of rurality suggest that those national fora working on issues of modern slavery should always have a strong element of their agendas which explicitly raises issues of prime concern for those in rural areas. The Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Modern-Day Slavery, the Human Trafficking Foundation, and the Local Government Association, amongst others. And it would also be useful if those agencies training people to work with the public were able specifically to focus on the differences between rural and urban contexts. So I'll leave you with a conundrum, a question. I analysed recently the NRM data for what I call largely rural police forces, and I'd include Cambridgeshire amongst those. I know Peterborough is a large city, but Cambridgeshire is largely rural, North Yorkshire, Cheshire, and so on. So I looked at the data for the largely rural police forces and the data for the largely urban police forces, and it's quite striking that pro rata, for every 100,000 people living in those areas, the number of victims identified was 3 times greater in urban areas than it was in rural areas. And the question is why? There are 4 or 5 different explanations which come to mind, And I'm working on a research proposal to try and explore that. Might be actually there are fewer people in modern slavery. That doesn't sound right to me. It might be that the resources are so few and far between for organisations that they're simply not picking up victims. It may be about competences and skills. It may be about all sorts of things. But the fact remains that modern slavery victims are not being identified in rural areas at anywhere near the rate that they are in urban areas. So I think there's something to follow up there, and I'm going to follow it up. Thank you for listening. There's clearly a substantial area of work to be done. Leave aside the need for policy and legal change at national level, and local organisations, I think, have got an agenda to work on over the coming months and years. If I had to point to one issue which needs addressing urgently, it's for statutory organisations to make much better use of local NGOs. They're the ears and the eyes of the local community. They're largely trusted by migrants, and as a result, they're the generators of an enormous amount of information and intelligence, which is being poorly used at present. Thank you very much.